My name is Jenna. I'm 45 years old, an ensign in the U.S. Navy, my voice steadying despite the knot in my chest. I pulled into the driveway of my grandmother's house, the faintest scent of antiseptic clinging to my uniform like a shroud as I stepped out of my car. I'm Jenna, 45 years old and an ensign in the U.S. Navy, and as I walked toward the front door, my heart pounded in rhythm with the frantic thumping of my thoughts. I still could not wrap my head around the fact that while I returned from the war in Afghanistan, my parents chose to celebrate their anniversary in Cabo, sipping cocktails on sunny shores while Grandma lay alone, fading away 3 blocks from where I stood. The tightness in my chest constricted with each breath, a stark reminder that sometimes home is the hardest place to return. The smell of hospital-grade disinfectant hit me as soon as I opened the door, a reality that my family seemed to have turned their backs on. I had imagined this reunion with my grandmother would be different, filled with laughter and stories, but here I was, her last hope, the one left to face this silent battle. I found her in the dimly lit living room, a skeletal figure wrapped in blankets that couldn't quite conceal the frail body she had once moved with such grace. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock the soft whispers of regret that filled the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to stave off the tears that threatened to spill over, but I could feel them simmering, hot and angry at the injustice of it all. As I approached her bedside, Grandma's eyes fluttered open, a flicker of recognition shining briefly before sorrow replaced it. "Jenna, my dear," she rasped, her voice a shadow of its former strength. Each of her fingers trembled in an effort to reach out, and I grasped her frail hand, feeling the brittle bones beneath my palm. It was a gesture that should have been warm, comforting, but instead, her icy skin sent a wave of despair crashing over me. The woman who had baked cookies and spun tales of the past was now a mere echo. I couldn't shake the resentment I felt toward my parents for abandoning her when she needed them most. Every second spent with her felt like an eternity, each heartbeat counting down to a moment I feared would come too soon. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from my father, a photo of him and my mother waving from the beach, their bright smiles starkly juxtaposed against the brittle reality I faced. How could they be so callous? I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the wave of emotion threatening to drown me. Grandma looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding pass between us, a recognition of the sacrifices that had led me back home and the family I now had to navigate. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the window, I tilted my head closer to her, determined to be the daughter and granddaughter my parents failed to be. I felt my resolve harden alongside the bittersweet ache in my chest. There would be no more empty weekends filled with laughter over margaritas, no more turning away from the harsh truths of family and duty. It was time to hold vigil for the woman who had given me everything, even if my parents had chosen to walk away. Maybe, just maybe, I could make peace with the weight of our fractured family before I had to say goodbye forever. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the untold stories of military women, courage, sacrifice, and truth. Your support helps more voices like mine be heard. The room is heavy with silence, punctuated only by the soft beeping of the machines that surround Grandma. The white walls seem to close in on us, every corner filled with a sense of inevitability. I sit at her bedside, my uniform pressed and neat, though I can't quite shake the feeling that it doesn't fit me right anymore. Just a few months ago, I was dressed for operations, focused on missions and strategy. Now, I'm here, caught in this liminal space between duty and helplessness, suffocated by the reality that my grandmother is slipping away. I can't help but wonder if she even knows I'm here. Outside the window, the sun is bright, casting warm light over the hospital room, a stark contrast to the cool, sterile atmosphere inside. I can hear laughter from the nearby nurses' station, where they gossip about their weekend plans, unaware of the gravity of what's happening just a few feet away. I want to scream at them to stop, to understand that life isn't just a series of cheerful highlights, but they carry on, oblivious. I think of my parents, lounging on a beach in Cabo, margaritas in hand, while I'm here in a far less glamorous reality. They don't even know that Grandma's condition has worsened. I didn't have the heart to tell them. How could I? They're on their holiday after all, free from responsibilities, just like they've always been. I stare at Grandma's frail body, her once vibrant spirit now a shadow of its former self. I remember her teaching me how to sail, her laughter ringing clear over the sound of waves crashing against the hull. I can almost hear her voice, steady and soothing, telling me that life is an adventure, that we should always embrace each moment. But here she is, tangled in tubes and wires, her breathing labored, and I can't help but feel lost. Every tick of the clock feels like a countdown I can't control. What if this is the last moment I get to share with her? Tears prick at my eyes, and I take a shaky breath. I pull my phone from my pocket, glancing at the photos of Afghanistan, filled with images of camaraderie and courage, but they seem so far removed from this somber reality. I've always prided myself on being strong, composed, ready for anything that comes my way. But here, in this moment, I feel utterly powerless. I reach for Grandma's hand, fragile and thin, and whisper, "I'm here, Grandma. You're not alone." My voice breaks, but I fight back the sobs. I want her to feel my presence, to know she isn't forgotten even as she drifts further from us. The sound of a soft knock brings me back to the present, and a nurse enters with a gentle smile, clipboard in hand. She glances at Grandma before looking to me with compassion. "It's good that you're here," she says quietly. "Spending time with loved ones can make a difference, even if it's just holding their hand." I nod, grateful for her kindness, though it doesn't ease the ache in my chest. The nurse adjusts the phone and checks the monitors, her movements deft and practiced. Each beeping sound resonates in my heart as I realize we're fighting a battle I can't win. My uniform feels like armor, a shield against the harsh realities of life, but no amount of training could prepare me for this. All I can do is stay by her side and hope that, somehow, my presence is enough to bridge the gap between us at this final moment. Sitting at the edge of the hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic stung through my nostrils, a constant reminder of the reality I was facing. Grandma's frail body lay there, so diminished from the woman I remembered, the woman who taught me how to bake cookies and who recounted stories of her youth that seemed so fantastical, I thought they were fiction. She looked out of place, like a remnant of an era that had long since passed. My heart tightened at the sight of her, so small and fragile, as if a single breath could shatter her, odd considering I had just returned from a war zone, where I had felt too much of everything, yet here I was, powerless against the weight of my grandma's fading light. A noisy party permeated my thoughts, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from a distant family gathering. My parents were thousands of miles away, sipping cocktails in Cabo while I sat alone at Grandma's bedside, battling the urge to scream at their absence. In that moment, an anger made of hurt simmered inside me, twisting into a knot. How could they leave her during her final moments? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. In their pursuit of leisure, they had stripped me of the support I desperately needed. I felt like an outsider looking in on a world that had moved on, while here I was, stuck grappling with the remains of family bonds that felt both tender and frayed. As I held Grandma's hand, her skin almost translucent against the stark white sheets, memories washed over me like waves. I was reminded of afternoons spent under the old oak tree in her backyard, where she'd tell me about her childhood and the sacrifices she'd made during the war. I'd laugh at her tales of trying to sneak out with her friends, but now, I realized we'd both fought our battles, albeit in different ways. Mine dressed in camouflage, hers wrapped in the fabric of the past, and yet her stories had shaped the very fabric of who I was. The ache in my chest deepened as I recalled how she often reminded me that courage wasn't just about facing the enemy, it was about facing the everyday struggles, too. And then, there it was, the moment. A flicker of recognition in her sunken eyes as they met mine, a brief connection that sent a jolt through my veins. I felt the walls around me recede, and suddenly, it was like I was 16 again, seeking her approval while navigating the inevitable high school drama. I remembered the day I told her about enlisting, the mixture of pride and worry etched into her features. "You make me proud, Jenna, but don't be reckless," she had said softly. In that single sentence lay the essence of her love, and now, I wished desperately that she could tell me that one more time. In that stark hospital room, the reality of her declining health collided with the echoes of my own experiences. It was a shock to realize that I had found resilience in a war-torn land, and yet now, in this intimate moment, I felt utterly helpless. The irony gnawed at me, fighting to protect lives abroad while the one who had nurtured me was fading from this world. The sense of duty that had once fueled my determination now felt like a heavy burden pressing down on my shoulders, and I struggled to reconcile the two halves of my life. I could feel tears prickling at the corner of my eyes, a bitter reminder that sometimes the strongest battles are fought not in foreign lands, but in the quietest moments at home. I stepped into the small, dimly lit hospital room, my heart heavy like it was strapped to an anchor. The air felt stale, old, as if time had stopped along with Grandma's faltering heart. I had just come back from months in Afghanistan, where life teetered on the edge of chaos, yet now I was confronted by a much quieter kind of turmoil. The rhythmic beep of the monitor pulsing steadily beside her bed felt like a metronome counting down the moments. I had returned home, but home felt different now, shredded like the flag I'd learned to honor. I glanced at her frail figure, skin thin as parchment, and brushed my fingers across her hand, warm but unresponsive. I remembered summers spent at her house in the country, where she'd bake pies and share stories about a world I could only dream of back then. But as I looked at her now, with tubes snaking in and out of her frailty, I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt wash over me. My parents had chosen Cabo over her hospital bed, and it stung like salt in a wound. They were living it up while I had to grapple with the reality that she might slip away before they returned. Part of me wanted to scream at them for abandoning her, for choosing cocktails by the pool over the woman who had held our family together. I recalled the nights spent trying to understand their decisions. My father, a man more comfortable in his leisure than in the depths of sorrow, had always struggled with emotional weight. My mother, always eager for sunshine, never understood the sacrifices of generations past. How had they lost sight of what family really meant? The weight of their absence felt like a betrayal, a festering wound, and I was left to shoulder the emotional burden alone while they partied as if nothing had changed. Sitting there, staring at Grandma's peaceful face, memories surged like a tide. I remembered the lessons she had taught me: courage, love, resilience, things I had drawn on time and again in the Navy. Her stories had ignited a fire in me, a desire to serve, to protect. Yet, looking back now, I realized I had become a soldier but still struggled to fight for my family. Grandma had always been my beacon, guiding me through darkness, and now I felt lost in a sea of resentment. Her legacy was a tapestry woven with love, and I feared my parents were unraveling it one thread at a time. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I leaned closer to Grandma. I needed to be there for her, to provide the comfort I could give while my parents chose the escapism of blue waters and sandy beaches. This was my duty now, and it felt both suffocating and liberating. As I held her hand and whispered stories of my own, of the courageous sailors I served alongside, of the bonds forged in adversity, I hoped she could hear me, that she could feel the love we shared wrapping around us like the warmth of a childhood hug. Perhaps I couldn't alter my parents' choices, but I could honor her life with my presence. I could make sure she didn't die alone, even if it meant battling my own inner demons to find peace in the process. The first time I wore my uniform when I came home from deployment, I thought I'd feel proud, like I was returning a hero. Instead, my heart felt heavy. As I pulled the freshly ironed fabric over my shoulders, it felt like a costume, some rigid shell that didn't quite fit. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman who had seen things that made me question humanity, and now here I was, back in the mundane reality of life where my grandma was alone and my parents, celebrating who knows what in Cabo. It felt like I'd stepped from one world into another without a guidebook. I hoped this uniform would grant me the respect I craved, or perhaps, the acceptance I lacked. I remember the first day back at the small-town pharmacy, the familiar bell chiming as I walked through the door. It hadn't changed, the same dusty shelves lined with the odd assortment of medicines and candy bars. My nerves were tight, and I forced myself to smile at Sharon behind the counter, who looked up with a mix of surprise and recognition. "Jenna, "You're back," she exclaimed. But behind her smile, I saw pity. The kind that wrapped around your throat, squeezing the joy out of the moment. I didn't need pity. I needed to prove that my life had purpose, that I had worth beyond the walls of war. I was a Navy ensign now, yet I felt like a ghost, drifting through a life I had almost forgotten in the sand and intensity of Afghanistan. Days turned into weeks, and each encounter only deepened my need to establish my identity, something more than just the granddaughter of a dying woman. I spent afternoons at the nursing home, sitting beside Grandma's frail form. She seemed to dim with each visit, the light behind her eyes flickering like a candle wavering in a draft. I would recount my adventures, the missions, the resilience of my comrades. "I'm doing good things, Grandma," I would insist, hoping she could grasp the weight of my words. But sometimes she simply nodded off, leaving me feeling more alone than I had in the desert. The connection I craved felt desperately out of reach, and instead of solace, I faced the stark reminder of my solitude. In moments of silence, it sometimes felt as if the uniform weighed heavier than my soul. I had downplayed my service back home, convinced that if I tucked the stories away, maybe nobody would expect me to carry that weight. But all I wanted was to be seen, to stand tall in the midst of my family's neglect. When I overheard my parents' laughter on a distant phone call from Cabo, sipping cocktails while my world fell apart at home, I realized their joviality felt like a deliberate choice to remain ignorant of the wreckage I was grappling with. I had enlisted to protect. Now, I wanted to protect my family, especially Grandma. I had to show them I was enough, even if it meant standing alone. As summer melted into fall, I began taking charge of Grandma's care. I dove headfirst into the logistics of her prescriptions, organizing her medications, and arranging visits with her doctors. It became my mission. I wanted to prove not only to my family but to myself that I was capable of making a difference, however small. I found quiet strength in these tasks, the routine becoming a balm for my own battles. I wanted to believe that my service extended beyond my uniform, that I could be the anchor for Grandma in this storm. Each moment spent with her was a chance to reclaim my worth, to redefine what it meant to serve. I finally realized that proving myself wasn't about grand gestures or accolades, it was about being present, about showing up even when the world felt heavy. The hospital room felt stark and suffocating, the fluorescent lights flickering like a broken promise. I stood by Grandma's bedside, my Navy uniform still crisp even though I hadn't slept much since landing back in the States. The weight of the deployment clung to me like a shroud, a constant reminder of what I had witnessed and felt. I'd thought I was stronger than this, that the grit of being an ensign would equip me to handle anything. But as I looked down at her frail body, the beeping machines, and the air thick with antiseptic, I felt smaller than my age suggested. I'd seen the worst of humanity, yet here I was, helpless before the decline of the most important woman in my life. I had only recently returned, my parents off in Cabo, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing here. They had a way of turning their backs when the choices became too hard, too heavy. I wanted to scream at them for prioritizing margaritas over Grandma's last breaths, but I held those words inside. I was a military officer, trained to compartmentalize my emotions, yet this felt different. I looked to Grandma, and in that moment, I recognized her strength was all I needed to find my own. It was so easy to slip into despair, but I had to be stronger for her. I grasped her hand softly, trying to push warmth into the brittle bones that were once vibrant and full of life. "Hey, Grandma," I whispered, forcing a smile even when my heart ached to its core. "I'm back." She didn't respond, her eyes closed, but I could almost hear her laughter echoing in my mind, her voice always encouraging me to be more than just my job, to live fiercely and on my own terms. In that moment, I realized that she wouldn't want me to crumble. She had fought so hard through life's battles herself, losing her husband, raising my mom alone, and now, as she lay there fighting a different war, I owed it to her to honor her spirit by being brave. I leaned closer, brushing a stray hair from her forehead, and recalled memories of summers spent on her porch, where she sang songs with an exuberance that seemed almost reckless. I could still smell the pies she baked, her laughter mixing with the scent of cinnamon. Remember when you told me that every challenge is a chance to grow? I murmured, my voice breaking. I need that lesson now. A tear slipped down my cheek as I spoke, acknowledging the pain but also embracing the lesson that every moment was an opportunity to push through. I had learned to navigate treacherous waters, but facing this reality was the most challenging mission I had ever faced. I sat there for what felt like hours, my fingers entwined with hers, waiting for a response, a sign of recognition. And then, in that profound silence, I felt a squeeze. It was faint but undeniable, a flicker of connection that ignited a flame of determination within me. Perhaps this was her way of reminding me to keep fighting, not just for her but for myself. Every hardship I faced in the Navy had equipped me to be resilient, but I realized that resilience extended beyond the battlefield. Life demanded it, too, especially in times like these. I took a deep breath, steadied my resolve, and promised myself that I would do better. I wouldn't let my parents' frivolous choices define this moment. I would honor my grandma's legacy by making sure she was not alone in her final days, surrounding her with love and memories. I finally understood that overcoming wasn't just about persistence, it was about embracing vulnerability and allowing the connections of the heart to guide me. As I sat there, I made a solemn vow to carry forth her spirit, to be brave not just for her but for the many battles still ahead, both at sea and at home. The sun had begun its descent behind the skyline of New York, casting long shadows through the hospital room where Grandma lay. I had been back from Afghanistan for only a few months, a world of gunfire and strategy replaced now by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the incessant beeping of machines. As I sat on the edge of her bed, watching the rise and fall of her frail body, I felt an aching contrast between my recent life of chaos and this profound stillness. I wanted to reach out and grasp her hand, to feel the warmth that once radiated from the strong woman who whispered tales from her youth. Instead, I felt the cold disbelief of my parents' decision to celebrate their anniversary in Cabo, leaving me to shoulder the weight of this farewell alone. I had faced uncertainty before, but nothing could have prepared me for the grief that washed over me in waves as I bore witness to her decline. Grandma had always been my anchor, guiding me through storms both personal and professional. The deep, gravelly voice that once inspired courage now barely whispered my name. I had left the confines of the Navy for this, a grand return home that felt less like a victory, more like a battleground of its own. I couldn't help but replay our last conversation in my head. She had talked of her garden, the way the roses used to bloom, and how she had instilled the same tenacity in me. Now, as I watched the life ebb from her, I felt that tenacity slipping away with her. As the days turned into nights, I found that I could not wallow in despair. I had fought to survive in Afghanistan, and I realized that the same strength I had called upon in the heat of combat now needed to be directed at making Grandma's final days as comfortable as possible. I became the constant presence by her side, reading books we both cherished and reminiscing about summers spent in her warm kitchen. With every story I shared, I could see a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a small connection that tied our two worlds together, the soldier and the matriarch. It was in these moments that I understood what persistence truly meant. It was never about winning battles, it was about showing up, day after day, in the face of loss. While my parents lounged on sandy beaches, I was learning to navigate the poignant lessons of life and death. There was a deepening understanding that I was not just there to ease her suffering but to learn from her resilience. Each day felt like a small victory, each moment spent together a step towards healing the wounds I had thought irreparable. I gathered strength from her, the way she gleaned wisdom from the world around her. That wisdom inspired me to forge my own path, showing me that growth often emerges from the darkest places. I found purpose in my commitment to her, and in that commitment, I connected with the woman who had once taught me how to plant seeds in a garden and tend to them through every season. As the final days approached, I could feel the fragility of our time together weighing heavily on my heart, but I was no longer afraid. I had learned to embrace the complexities of life, utilizing the skills I honed in service. I wrapped my fingers around her hand, steadying my breath as I remembered the drills, the focus, the fortitude I had cultivated. I wasn't just holding on to her, I was letting her spirit seep into mine. I would carry her lessons forward, channeling the love and strength she imparted. It felt fitting that my first big mission back home would be to honor this powerful woman, allowing her legacy to grow within me as I transformed grief into gratitude, ensuring that her spirit would never truly be alone. When I returned from Afghanistan in 2010, I thought I could finally breathe again. The weight of combat had clung to me like second skin, but all I wanted was to embrace my family, to find solace in the ordinary moments I had missed. My parents' idea of reunion, however, turned out to be quite different. They had decided to leave for Cabo, their sun-soaked escape conveniently timed to coincide with the days I had anticipated to reconnect. Instead of the joyful embraces I had envisioned, I was confronted with the stark reality of my grandmother's failing health. She lay in her modest bedroom, a fragile shell of the woman who had taught me how to tie my boots just a few years earlier. At first, I felt a knot of bitterness twist in my stomach. How could they choose relaxation over family? My heart ached, torn between anger and sorrow. My mother's voice was crisp and cheerful as she explained their plans, as if I were just another obligation in a world that didn't fit her anymore. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, but instead, I found myself sitting in the quiet of my grandmother's room, her frail body resting under blankets, the faint smell of lavender trying to mask the clinical scent of medicine. The beeping of the heart monitor felt like the ticking of a countdown, and each sound rang painfully in my ears. Days blurred into one another as I took on the role of caregiver. I held Grandma's hand, listening to her stories about a time when the world felt safer, when her own battles were battles worth fighting. I watched her drift in and out of lucidity, her eyes sometimes sharp and bright, other times clouded and vacant. Each time she looked at me, I felt a flicker of recognition, but then it would vanish, like smoke slipping through fingers. I wished I could bottle those moments when she remembered my name clearly, when her voice was steady enough to share her wisdom. I longed for her to linger there, to teach me just one more lesson about resilience, about holding on when everything feels like it's slipping away. I learned to find beauty in the moments of connection, however fleeting they may be. I would sit next to her and read, the words flooding the room with a sense of normalcy. I'd tell her about my time in the service, how I had to summon courage even when it threatened to drown me. I hoped she could hear me say that her strength was my strength, that the woman who had taught me how to be tough was still my beacon. Those days felt bittersweet, with each laugh echoing the reality that every chuckle was a moment closer to goodbye. I wanted to preserve everything, her smile, the smell of her favorite tea, the way her eyes sparkled when she reminisced. In those heavy weeks, I grappled with the reality of loss while my parents lounged beneath the Cabo sun, seemingly oblivious. I found solace in knowing that I was present, that I could be the granddaughter she deserved, even when I felt so alone. I would stay up at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the things left unsaid. I wanted to fill the silence with promises I could no longer keep. But in the end, I realized that being there, holding her hand through the pain and uncertainty, was the greatest tribute I could offer. I was no longer the little girl running to her for comfort, but the woman who could say goodbye with a heart full of memories and gratitude, carving my own resilience from the love she had given me all along. I walked into the small, dimly lit bar in town, the familiar scent of hops and aged wood wrapping around me like an old blanket. The chatter and laughter of my peers felt both inviting and distant. They were celebrating one of their own, a fellow officer who had just received a commendation that, if we're being honest, he'd more than earned. I used to thrive in these moments, but now, a tightening knot formed in my stomach as I approached the group. The trio of medals dangling from his chest glimmered like a beacon of accomplishment, a stark reminder of what I couldn't quite grasp myself. Years spent in the Navy hadn't prepared me for the weight of admiration in the eyes of my colleagues. It should have felt rewarding to be surrounded by fellow sailors, but instead, I felt like an imposter. Hadn't I just returned from months in Afghanistan, witnessing the absurdity of war while my grandmother lay dying alone at home? Their laughter echoed against the backdrop of my thoughts, a dissonance that made me question the very nature of recognition. What did it mean to be acknowledged for bravery and sacrifice when another part of your life felt so painfully neglectful? As the evening unfolded, I listened to stories of valor, shared beers, and camaraderie, but every laugh felt like a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who had stayed behind to hold the fort, to support their families. I was torn between pride for my role and guilt for not embracing the recognition that my peers seemed to wear effortlessly. I knew I had served proudly, but all I could think about were the missed calls from my mother about Grandma's condition, her frail voice echoing in my head, reminding me of the emergency leave I couldn't take. Their cheers felt like a distant celebration of someone else's life, not mine, and that made my chest tighten further. Then, as if the universe sensed my struggle, someone raised a toast in my honor. They spoke words of admiration, how I had pushed through, how I had served with dedication. I wanted to hear it, to feel it sinking into my bones, but I couldn't shake that gnawing feeling of isolation. I thought of Grandma with her weathered hands and the whisper of her stories that had been drowned out by the chaos of my deployment. I felt simultaneously proud and ashamed, standing here as the center of attention while another part of my world crumbled away unnoticed. The weight of my twin realities sat heavy on my shoulders. I smiled and raised my glass, echoing their cheers, but inside, I felt like a ghost drifting between two worlds. Recognition from my peers was a double-edged sword. It brought warmth mixed with the chill of grief. I often wondered if others felt this way too, if they carried their own unseen burdens beneath those cheerful exteriors. In that moment, as I sipped my drink, I realized that recognition isn't simply a badge of honor. It's a reminder of everything we've left behind, the paths we chose, and the faces we've tragically distanced ourselves from. It was a bittersweet acknowledgement that sometimes, your heart belongs to two places at once. Grandma's hospital room felt like a tomb. The antiseptic smell stung my nostrils, and the muted beeping of machines was the only sound breaking the sterile silence. I stood at the doorway, hesitating. It was a far cry from the chaotic dust storms of Helmand, where each moment was drenched in the urgency of impending danger. Here, it felt like the world had slowed to a crawl. My family had chosen Cabo, a sun-soaked escape, while I was left to face the harrowing reality of death alone, wrapped in the kind of isolation that only comes when the rest of your family has chosen flight over fight. As I stepped inside, Grandma lifted her frail head from the pillow, her gaze penetrating even through the haze of medication. "You look tired, Jenna," she said, her voice weak but steady. The familiar scent of her jasmine lotion lingered in the air, and for a moment, it transported me back to her small kitchen, where I'd spend hours listening to her stories about resilience. It felt surreal to be here, navigating the bittersweet terrain between my past and present as a Navy ensign, grappling with the weight of duty both on and off the battlefield. I took a breath, squaring my shoulders, as if preparing for a mission. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady, though the tremor within revealed the storm raging inside me. She smiled, a faint curling of her lips that barely touched her eyes. There was an almost conspiratorial glint in her gaze, like she knew the battlefield I had just come from, the sacrifices I had made, yet here we were, facing perhaps the most significant battle together, her letting go. I could feel a knot tightening in my chest. How cruel it was that I had been trained to confront fear but felt utterly helpless here. "I'm ready," she murmured, her eyes drifting to the thick quilt that covered her frail body. "But it's not only me, Jenna." I felt her words strike a chord deep within, the unspoken truth of my family's abandonment hanging heavy in the air. "They've missed so much," she whispered. I clenched my fists, anger rising. How could they party on the beach while she lay here alone? The reality of my parents' choices stung, the disconnection that had grown like a chasm between us. I hadn't faced IEDs or gunfire for this, watching the woman who had once been my anchor drift away into the abyss, all while my parents danced carefreely under the sun. I took her frail hand, the skin like parchment against my palm, and squeezed it gently, willing strength into her. "You fought hard, Grandma. You taught me to never back down." Those glistening eyes bore into mine, and for a heartbeat, I felt the weight of generations pass between us, love, loss, and a fierce tenacity to hold on. I had armored myself against the world, but here, in this fragile moment, the armor slipped. I was just a granddaughter wanting to fight for the woman who had given me so much. In that room, the conflict of duty versus love echoed stronger than any war song I'd ever heard. I would confront my parents later. It was time to face the heart of the battle that truly mattered. The stark white walls of the hospital made everything feel sterile and surreal. I stood there, hesitating in the doorway, as the sounds of the machines beeped persistently, punctuating the tense silence. My grandma, frail and sunken, lay on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. A faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixing uncomfortably with the memories of her kitchen, where the aroma of fresh pies once filled the space. The juxtaposition was jarring. I had come back from the chaos of Afghanistan, and yet this felt like the hardest battle I'd ever faced, watching the woman who had taught me how to tie my shoelaces and read the stars slip away silently. Mom's voice echoed in my mind, her laughter fading into the sun-soaked backdrop of Cabo. "We'll be right back." "Just a little getaway," she had chirped. I felt pangs of resentment rising within me, a bitter cocktail of anger and sadness. How could they prioritize a vacation over Grandma's last moments? My parents had always been good at putting fun ahead of family, but here, in a hospital where we were supposed to gather strength and support one another, I felt abandoned. Their flighty lifestyle, marked by indulgence and escapism, left me alone to shoulder the weight of this heartbreak. It was as if their absence was a glaring spotlight on the fractured connections within our family. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, determined to remain strong. As I approached the bed, my fingers trembled slightly, hovering above her bony hand before gently clasping it in mine. "Hi, Grandma," I whispered, my voice cracking. She turned her head slowly, the effort visible on her face, but when our eyes met, a flicker of recognition lit up her gaze. It was the same look of warmth that had greeted me every holiday, every Sunday dinner. But now, those warm memories felt like a distant echo, a cruel reminder of everything we were about to lose. I squeezed her hand, hoping the connection could soothe us both, that it could bridge the gap between my chaotic life and her quiet exit. All the training I had undergone as an ensign had prepared me for physical battles, not for emotional ones that tore at the fabric of my heart. I wanted to be brave, to stand tall in the face of adversity, yet here I was, crumbling in the face of impending loss. I couldn't process my pain without thinking of how my parents had chosen pleasure over presence. What did their absence say about our family? Were we tied together by blood alone, or was love supposed to be the glue? I was reminded that love often feels thin, fragile under the weight of absence. Would this moment define the rest of our lives? Would my grandma's last breath become a punctuation mark in a story I still needed to write? As the hours passed, a nurse entered, wheeling in a cart of supplies and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She offered platitudes about how brave Grandma was, how she had fought through so much. I could see the sympathy in her gaze, but it felt disingenuous, a rehearsed line delivered in the sterile atmosphere of death. I wanted to scream that bravery wasn't enough when faced with an enemy like time, especially when I felt I had an opponent right beside me in my parents' neglect. Instead, I nodded, forcing a smile, trying to maintain dignity in a situation that was stripping it away piece by piece. In that moment, it became clear, I was alone, and it was up to me to make sure her story didn't end without a fight. I took a deep breath as I stood at Grandma's grave, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the freshly turned earth. Years had passed since I returned from Afghanistan, yet the weight of that moment never really left me. I remember the hollowness of coming home to find my parents more interested in their vacation than in the woman who had poured love into every moment of my childhood. It wasn't just their absence that stung, it was the realization that I was no longer seeking their approval. I'd spent too much of my life striving to please people who didn't see my worth. Grandma's slow decline had forced me to confront that truth, and being with her in those final days taught me more about love and resilience than any military training ever could. I stood there, feeling the strength of the woman who had raised me, who had taught me that I could weather any storm. She had been the one to put a bandage on my scraped knees as a child, to stitch my torn heart as a teenager when I had my first crush. Even in her last moments, Her fading presence grounded me, whispering lessons of courage that echoed in my heart long after she was gone. I had craved my parents' acknowledgement while I served in the Navy, wishing to have them stand proudly at my side during my promotions. But the void of their absence during the most pivotal moments of my life had forced me to realize that my worth was not dictated by their approval but by my actions and my service. Every deployment I made reminded me that I was not just their daughter. I was a sailor, an ensign in the U.S. Navy, a woman of my own making. I learned to embrace the strength that had blossomed from pain, to carry forward the legacy of resilience Grandma had instilled in me. No longer was I the little girl who needed validation. I began to see my own reflection in the bravery of those I served alongside, in the faces of young sailors who looked up to me not for who my parents were, but for what I had accomplished. Each day, each mission reaffirmed that I was building a life beyond anyone else's expectations. As I placed a bouquet of daisies on Grandma's grave, I felt a rush of warmth wash over me. I didn't need to mourn what could have been. Instead, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the moments we shared. I wanted to honor her memory, to carry forward the lessons she taught me about strength and resilience. I made a promise to myself that day, standing alone in that cemetery, to live my life unapologetically. To forge my own path and to surround myself with people who recognized my worth, not those who diminished it. It was time to elevate my own voice and let it ring loud and clear. And so I walked away from that grave, feeling the sun's warmth envelop me like a gentle hug. The weight lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of liberation. I looked back one last time, seeing the grave against a backdrop of sprawling trees and an endless sky. It symbolized a chapter closed, yet it also whispered of new beginnings. I realized I was stepping into my own light, free from the shadows of the past, with a heart ready to embrace whatever came next. Just like Grandma had done for me, I was ready to be a beacon of strength for those around me. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from.